Cleaning lady helps a CEO fix his tie before a speech. Then she said something that stopped him cold. Mason Caldwell had 2 minutes left before the curtain lifted. Not 2 minutes to impress investors. 2 minutes to decide if he'd protect his company or sign something that could destroy it. And the only thing between him and the stage was a tie that wouldn't move. It felt ridiculous until it didn't. He tugged the knot again, harder this time. The silk tightened like it had a mind of its own. His fingers slipped, his breath got shallow, and the mirror showed a man losing control. Outside, the crowd's applause rolled like thunder through the walls. Inside, he heard only his own pulse. On the table beside him sat the contract everyone came to celebrate. Neat pages, crisp edges, a few lines marked in Japanese. Mason had signed deals worth millions of dollars. But tonight, his eyes kept dodging that document, like something on it was staring back. If you believe in compassion and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how one small act can change everything. The door opened with a soft click. A cleaning lady stepped in, pushing a cart that squeaked once and then went quiet. She froze when she saw him struggling, then lowered her gaze like she didn't belong there. Her name tag read, Riley Hart, in plain black letters. Mason barely noticed it at first. Riley didn't rush or apologize too much. She just took in the room, the suit, the shaking hands, the contract on the table. Her eyes flicked to the Japanese text for half a second, then back to Mason's tie, like she'd seen this exact moment before, like she knew how it usually ends. "You want help?" she asked, voice gentle, almost careful. Mason's instinct was to say no, not because he didn't need it, but because someone like him wasn't supposed to need it. Then he heard the announcer say his name again, louder, so he nodded once. Riley stepped closer and lifted her hand slowly. No flirting, no fuss, just calm and focus. She loosened the knot with one smooth motion that made Mason blink. Her fingers worked like she was fixing something more than fabric, like she was giving him a breath back. The tie fell into place, perfect and simple. Mason swallowed, ready to say thanks and move on. But Riley's eyes drifted to the contract again, and her face changed. Not fear, not drama, just a quiet certainty that landed like a warning. And then she started to speak. Mason Caldwell hadn't always imagined himself standing behind stages like this, wrapped in tailored suits and quiet pressure. He had started Whitford Solutions in a rented office with second-hand desks and a laptop that overheated every afternoon. Back then, success felt distant and almost unreal. Now it pressed against his chest like the tight knot in his tie. Everything he'd built was about to be confirmed in one public moment. The event itself was flawless by design. Soft lights washed over the auditorium. Screens glowed with clean charts, and every seat was filled. Investors whispered, cameras adjusted, and assistants moved with rehearsed precision. It was the kind of night people described as historic later. Mason knew that once he stepped on stage, there would be no room for hesitation, or so he believed. On the small table behind him lay the contract that made this night possible. A thick document, clipped neatly, its pages heavy with promise and risk. Most of it was in English, carefully polished by lawyers and advisors, but several sections were printed in Japanese, left untouched, except for a small folded corner. Mason trusted the process more than the paper itself. He had been told everything was secure, reviewed twice, approved unanimously. The deal would open markets, stabilize revenue, and guarantee thousands of jobs. At least, that was how it had been presented. Mason repeated those points to himself like a calming script. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to the pages he couldn't read, not because he distrusted anyone, but because something about them felt unfinished. Riley Hart moved quietly around the room, doing what she did every night, emptying bins, straightening chairs, wiping surfaces no one noticed unless they were dirty. She'd learned how to be invisible without becoming small. Years of working late shifts had taught her how to observe without interrupting. She noticed patterns, moods, and moments people thought were private. She saw Mason before he saw her, the way his shoulders rose and fell too fast, the way his hands paused on the tie, then tried again. This wasn't just nerves before a speech. It was something heavier. Riley had seen that look before, on people standing at crossroads without knowing it yet. She slowed her steps without realizing why. Her eyes caught the contract by accident, not the English text, but the Japanese section. The phrasing looked familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten slightly. It wasn't dramatic, just uncomfortable, like recognizing a voice from a bad memory. She didn't read everything. She didn't need to. One clause was enough to raise a quiet alarm. Mason finally noticed her presence when the room felt too silent. He turned, surprised, then nodded politely. To him, she was just part of the background of a successful night. To Riley, he was a man about to make a decision that would ripple far beyond this stage. Neither of them understood yet how deeply their paths were about to cross. And as the applause outside grew louder, both of them felt the same strange tension. A sense that this moment wasn't just about a contract or a speech. It was about something fragile, something human, waiting to be either protected or ignored, and neither of them knew which way it would go yet. Riley hesitated for a brief second before speaking, not because she was unsure, but because she understood timing. People like Mason rarely heard warnings unless they arrived gently. She adjusted the knot of his tie with careful hands, smoothing the fabric until it sat perfectly against his collar. Only then did she speak, as if the order of things mattered more than the words themselves. She mentioned the document on the table in a calm, almost casual tone, saying she recognized the language by habit. Japanese, she explained, had once been part of her daily life. Mason reacted with a polite smile, the kind executives used when conversations drifted into territory they didn't plan for. He reassured her that the contract had been reviewed by professionals and that everything was already decided. Riley didn't argue. She didn't correct him or raise her voice. She simply pointed out that one clause, buried deep in formal language, shifted responsibility in a way most people wouldn't notice unless they knew exactly what to look for. She said it softly, without accusation, like someone sharing weather news rather than danger. That calm made the words heavier, not lighter. Mason felt the change immediately, even though he didn't want to. The confidence he'd carried all evening cracked just enough to let doubt through. He asked her what she meant, still half smiling, still hoping this was nothing. Riley explained that if the partnership failed for reasons outside his control, the financial and legal burden would land entirely on his company, not partially, completely. The applause outside grew louder as his name echoed again through the speakers. Mason glanced toward the stage entrance, then back at Riley. Two realities pulled at him in opposite directions. One led to applause, validation, and momentum. The other led to uncertainty, delay, and questions he wasn't ready to answer. Riley stepped back, giving him space, unaware that she had just pushed his life onto a new path. For a moment, Mason said nothing. He straightened his jacket, touched the tie Riley had fixed, and tried to steady his breathing. He told himself he could deal with this later, that now wasn't the time. But the words she'd spoken refused to settle. They hovered between them, unresolved, waiting for him to either dismiss them or listen. Riley turned toward her cart, ready to leave the room and return to her shift. She had said what she felt was right, and she didn't expect anything in return. People rarely did. But as she reached for the handle, she sensed that something had shifted behind her. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself. Mason called her name before she could take another step. His voice sounded different now, lower, stripped of performance. He asked her, quietly, if she was certain. Riley met his eyes and nodded once, not as a challenge, but as a promise. And in that moment, Mason realized that whatever choice he made next, there would be no going back. Mason stood still for a few seconds after calling Riley's name, aware that every second mattered, and yet unable to move. The applause outside felt distant now, like noise from another life he wasn't fully part of anymore. His hand rested on the edge of the table, close to the contract, but he didn't touch it. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years, stripped of certainty and forced into presence. He asked Riley to explain again, slower this time, what she had seen, not because he doubted her intelligence, but because he was hoping she might soften the meaning. Riley didn't dramatize anything. She spoke plainly, explaining how certain contracts were written to look balanced while quietly placing all risk on one side. She said it was common in rushed international deals where trust replaced scrutiny. As she spoke, Mason's mind raced through faces he knew by heart. Employees who had grown with the company, managers who trusted his judgment, families whose stability depended on the decisions he made in rooms like this. The weight of leadership settled in his chest, heavier than applause or praise ever had been. This wasn't about embarrassment on stage. It was about responsibility. Riley's voice stayed calm, but her eyes carried something deeper than information. There was concern there, and something like memory. Mason noticed it without fully understanding why it mattered. He realized she wasn't trying to prove anything or gain anything. She was simply refusing to stay silent when silence could cause harm. That realization unsettled him more than the clause itself. The announcer's voice echoed again, firmer now, signaling that the reminder was becoming an expectation. Mason looked toward the stage entrance, then back at Riley. His throat tightened as he imagined stepping into the lights and delivering words he no longer believed were safe. The version of himself who loved control wanted to move forward anyway. The part of him that still cared wanted to stop. Riley took a step back, sensing the pressure closing in on him. She told him she understood if he needed to go. She said she didn't expect him to change anything based on a comment from someone like her. The way she said, someone like her, wasn't bitter, just realistic. That quiet humility made the moment heavier, not easier. Mason felt something close to fear, but it wasn't panic. It was the fear of choosing wrong when you finally see the stakes clearly. He realized how alone he was in that room, despite the hundreds of people waiting for him outside. Power didn't come with company in moments like this. It came with silence and choice. He took a slow breath and asked Riley to wait just a moment longer. He didn't explain why. He didn't promise anything. He just needed her there, grounding him in something real while he decided what kind of leader he was about to be. And as the seconds slipped away, the distance between who he had been and who he might become started to open. Mason finally made his decision not with a speech, but with a pause. When he stepped onto the stage, the lights were warm, the applause generous, and the room ready to celebrate a victory that had already been written in their minds. He began exactly as rehearsed, his voice steady, his posture confident, delivering the opening lines about growth, trust, and shared vision. From the outside, nothing seemed different, yet inside him, every word felt heavier than before. As he continued, Mason became acutely aware of the contract folded neatly inside his jacket. It pressed against his chest like a reminder that words could promise safety, while actions created consequences. He glanced briefly at the front row, where board members smiled with relief, expecting the final announcement. For the first time in his career, Mason felt disconnected from the applause meant for him. He slowed his speech almost without realizing it, allowing silence to settle between sentences. He spoke about responsibility instead of opportunity, about long-term care instead of quick expansion. The audience leaned in, sensing a shift even if they couldn't name it. This wasn't the polished finale they expected, but it was something more honest than planned. Then Mason stopped completely. He acknowledged the partnership everyone had come to hear about, but explained that the formal signing would be postponed. He said the company needed a little more time to ensure every detail aligned with their values and their people. The words landed gently, yet the impact was immediate. The room fell into a stunned quiet, broken only by a few confused murmurs. Backstage, assistants exchanged worried glances while board members stiffened in their seats. This wasn't rebellion or drama, but restraint, and that made it harder to challenge. Mason thanked the audience for their patience and stepped away from the microphone before anyone could interrupt him. The applause that followed was uncertain, scattered, and real in a way rehearsed moments never were. As he left the stage, Mason felt his pulse racing, not from fear of backlash, but from relief. For the first time that evening, he wasn't pretending everything was under control. He had chosen delay over denial, and that choice created space for truth to enter. He didn't know yet what the consequences would be, only that he could breathe again. In the hallway, Riley was waiting exactly where he had asked her to stay. She watched him approach, reading his face carefully, and seemed to understand before he spoke that something had changed. Mason thanked her, Not with grand words, but with sincerity that surprised them both. He told her she might have just saved his company. Riley didn't celebrate or smile broadly. She simply nodded, as if she had expected him to listen all along. But as they stood there together, Mason realized that postponing the signing was only the beginning. The real challenge was still ahead, and it would require more than courage in front of an audience. It would require him to face truths he had avoided for years. The hours that followed felt longer than the years Mason had spent building his company. In a small conference room away from the stage lights, the board gathered around him with polite smiles that barely concealed their tension. Questions came quickly, framed as concern but sharpened by fear of loss, and Mason answered each one